In the years immediately after the conversion of the Emperor Constantine in 312 AD, one thinker stands head and shoulders above all others. Aurelius Augustinus, later to be known as St. Augustine, was not only immensely influential in his own time, but has had a profound effect on theologians, philosophers, political theorists, ethicists, and even upon literary theorists ever since. As a thinker, as an influence, there is no one to rival him in the early history of the Church in the West. Augustine was born in the Roman province of Africa, which is present-day Tunisia and eastern Algeria, in the city of Tagaste in 354 AD. At the time of his birth, Christianity had been officially accepted and was well on the way to being entrenched as the official religion of the empire. As a young man, Augustine was attracted to Manichaeism, a dualistic system of thought that posits a radical division between equipotent principles of good and evil. His Manichaean period lasted about 10 years, after which he became attracted to Neoplatonism. Having taught rhetoric in Carthage and Rome, he moved to Milan in 384 as a professor of rhetoric and came under the influence of St. Ambrose. He became a Christian, was baptized together with his son Adeodatus in 387 AD. He returned to Africa to live his life first as a monk, then as a reluctant bishop of Hippo, a city second in size and importance only to Carthage, where he died in 430 AD. There are writers whose personal lives are radically detached from their literary productions. One such would be Thomas Aquinas. Augustine is most emphatically not one of these. Everything he writes bears the impress of his personality. To discover something of the character of the man, we are fortunate to have his Confessions. This intellectual biography, the first example of the confessional literary genre, is absolutely essential reading for anyone wishing to come to grips with Augustine's thought. It is both the spiritual autobiography of an individual and a map of the soul's journey to God. In this work, Augustine reveals himself to us as human, all too human, prone to all the temptations of the spirit and the flesh. If to be emotionally transparent is to wear your heart on your sleeve, then Augustine wears a heart on both of his. Consider the following revealing passage. He writes, "The woman with whom I had been living was torn from my side as an obstacle to my marriage, and this was a blow which crushed my heart to bleeding because I loved her dearly. She went back to Africa, vowing never to give herself to any other man, and left with me the son whom she had borne me. But I was too unhappy and too weak to imitate this example set me by a woman. I was impatient at the delay of 2 years which had to pass before the girl whom I had asked to marry became my wife, and because I was more a slave of lust than a true lover of marriage, I took another mistress." Augustine was a writer with an incredible range of interests and an even more incredible capacity for producing written work. Writers are sometimes described as voluminous. In Augustine's case, this is literally true. He produced some 117 books in 44 years, in theology, philosophy, history, and rhetoric. Despite this vast output, he wrote no single work on what we should now call political philosophy or political theory. To find out what he thought on political matters, we have to disentangle the relevant material from his thoughts on ethics, on history, on the nature of man, and on theology. Robert Marcus remarks that while there are certainly elements of reflection on political theory to be found in his writings, his own explicit remarks in this area constitute no clear body of political thought. The single most important source for this chapter will be his treatise on the City of God, De Civitate Dei, but reference will also be made from time to time to others of his works, including his letters and sermons. References to this work will be by book and chapter, e.g. 15:4 means Book 15, Chapter 4. The City of God was occasioned by the Goths' sack of Rome in 410 AD and its political aftermath. But what Augustine eventually produced transcends by far the limits of its occasion, just as Newman's Apologia Pro Vita Sua transcends its occasioning by a controversy with Charles Kingsley. In the City of God, Augustine produced a massive work of over 1,000 pages, about which he himself rightly remarked, it may be too much for some, too little for others. The first 10 books of the City of God defend the Christian faith against pagan attacks. Christianity, Augustine argues, was not responsible for the fall of Rome any more than paganism was responsible for its rise. Popular paganism is in no way satisfactory as a religion, although Augustine considers the Neoplatonism of Porphyry to present a challenge more worthy of his mettle. Having disposed of the pagans, Augustine turns in the remaining 12 books of his work to his proper theme, the tale of two cities, not London and Paris, but the earthly city and the city of God. Before turning to consider what these two cities signify, it will be useful to reflect on Augustine's view of man, in many ways the key to his political and social thought. For Augustine, man is a creature only somewhat less mysterious to himself than God is. Even though we live with ourselves day by day, we are never wholly transparent to ourselves. Augustine's man is decidedly not the detached, bloodless Cartesian ego. He is an embodied creature with all that implies. For Augustine, writes Elcian, the mind can never be transparent to itself. We are never wholly in control of our thoughts. Our bodies are essential, not contingent, to who we are and how we think. And we know that we exist not because I think, therefore I am, but rather I doubt, therefore I know I exist. Augustine has Stoic doctrine firmly in his critical sights when he argues that human beings are not just rational beings, but emotional beings as well. If the Stoic state of apatheia, which Augustine, coining a new word, calls impassibility, were achievable, it would be, Augustine thinks, the worst possible outcome. He writes, if apatheia is the name of the state in which the mind cannot be touched by any emotion whatsoever, who would not judge this insensitivity to be the worst of all moral defects? On the other hand, if this impassibility were to be understood as a lack of the disturbing emotions that defy reason, it would be a good thing, but it is not something achievable in this life. Human beings are social and relational beings. Made in the image of the Trinitarian God, who is himself essentially relational, human beings are not detached and isolated egos. We are always in society. The question is not whether we shall be social, but how we shall be social. Even criminals are social by nature. A thief may be a sole trader, unwilling to trust others to work with him in his enterprises or doubting their competence to do so. But even such a solitary predator requires that his associates act according to some kind of order, and, if he has a family, he will expect the members of that family to respect his authority. Society is just one form of friendship, friendship being a kind of union in which a plurality strive for a shared good. Charity, for Augustine, begins at home, but it doesn't end there. The natural ties of familial affection are directed outwards and radiate towards others, thus binding together an ever-increasing number of individuals. Language aids in this binding, but there is always the possibility of being misunderstood. Where languages differ, this difficulty escalates. Life in society is a complex, resulting not only from our love for ourselves and others, but also, and here we're getting close to the roots of Augustine's political thought, our lust for domination. Man is moved to act, thinks Augustine, by the object of his love. Our love may be a merely transient and fleeting desire, as for an ice cream on a sunny day, or it may be a deeper habitual orientation towards some good, such as for knowledge, or it may be an all-encompassing fundamental orientation, as towards good or evil, God or not God. Some things we desire are desired merely as a means to something else. Other things are desired in themselves. The former are merely used, the latter are enjoyed. Music, for example, though it can be used for various purposes, is essentially useless. So too is a baby. Only something that is lovable in and for itself, and not as a means to something else, can bring happiness to man, thinks Augustine. At the start of his Confessions, Augustine, addressing God directly, says famously, "You made us for yourself, and our hearts find no peace until they rest in you." No created thing then, however good it may be, is capable of bringing cessation to our restless longings. Augustine, notoriously no despiser of the good things of creation, remarks of physical beauty that it is a good created by God, but it is a temporal, carnal good, very low in the scale of goods, and if it is loved in preference to God, the eternal, internal, and sempiternal good, that love is as wrong as the miser's love of gold, though the fault is in man, not in the gold. This is true of everything created. Though it is good, it can be loved in the right way or in the wrong way. However, because of sin, original and personal, our loves are disordered, so that we crave the merely instrumental and useful, as if they were final goods, not only the usual suspects of wealth and sensual pleasure, but also the more deadly and less obvious culprits such as glory, reputation, and especially domination over others. Because of his disordered inner life, man is in conflict with himself, and so, not surprisingly, in conflict with others. And that brings us to Augustine's two cities. In the City of God, Augustine famously maintains that mankind is divided into two groups, one belonging to the City of God, the other to the earthly city. He writes, "Although there are many great peoples throughout the world living under different customs in religion and morality, and distinguished by a complex variety of languages, arms, and dress, it is still true that there have come into being only two main divisions, as we may call them, in human society, and we are justified in following the lead of our scriptures and calling them two cities. There is, in fact, one city of men who choose to live by the standard of the flesh, another of those who choose to live by the standard of the Spirit." It is a mistake, one easy to make, but one nonetheless to be avoided, to understand Augustine in making this distinction to be indicating two specific identifiable political entities. This is not so. The City of God is not the Church. The two cities are mixed together in this world. He writes, "Those two cities are interwoven and intermixed in this era and await separation at the last judgment." At least part of what Augustine is up to in his distinction between the City of God and the earthly city is a claim that any attempt to identify the City of God with any earthly city is likely to lead to idolatry and to an inappropriate attempt at the sacralization of purely human institutions, mistakes that have not always been successfully resisted by Christians. Just as the character of a man's will is determined by the kinds of things he loves, so too the character of a society is determined by the nature of that common love which is constitutive of that society. Formal membership of the Church does not ensure one a place in the ranks of the saints, for some members of the Church have actually turned their wills away from the love of God, while others, outside the formal structure of the Church, have inclined their wills towards God. If we call to mind Augustine's definition of a people, which is the association of a multitude of rational beings united by a common agreement on the objects of their love, then it is obvious that those who have turned their wills away from God are not loyal citizens of the City of God. It is, however, important to note that while the boundaries of the hierarchical Church may not be coterminous with the communion of saints on earth, it is the channel of divine grace from God to man. In this sense, then, the Church's mission on earth is irreducibly social, in that it is its task to bring as many people as possible into fellowship with the citizens of the City of God. The fate of the citizens of the two cities, then, is ultimately determined by the object of their fundamental, not merely transient love. The City of God is made up of those who love God above all else, a love, says Augustine, that rejoices in a good that is at once shared by all and unchanging, a love that makes one heart out of many. The earthly city is constituted of those who love themselves and, significantly, love dominion. Augustine writes, "The two cities were created by two kinds of love. The earthly city was created by self-love, reaching the point of contempt for God. The heavenly city by the love of God, carried as far as contempt for self. In the former, the earthly city, the lust for domination lords it over its princes, as over the nations it subjugates. In the other, both those put in authority and those subject to them serve one another in love, the rulers by their counsel, the subjects by obedience." The restlessness that characterizes the human heart if not directed towards its proper object, God, will find some temporary satisfaction in dominion, a dominion that, taken to its conclusion, leads to the creation of kingdoms and empires, and an ambition to be the ruler. For when can that lust for power in arrogant hearts, writes Augustine, come to rest until after passing from one office to another, it arrives at sovereignty? Man is a social animal and requires society for his development. Augustine sees society as something more than an accidental conglomeration of individuals. And while he recognizes the number and the gravity of the disorders that flow from man's social nature, he still asks, how could the city have made its first start? How could it have advanced along its course? How could it attain its appointed goal if the life of the saints were not social? Justice is the foundational virtue of civil society. It preserves peace, the common good of society, and without peace no society can subsist, let alone prosper. Although a Roman himself, Augustine is keen to demonstrate that Rome as a state was never actuated by true justice, not even in its early pre-decadent phase. Justice, for Augustine, requires the subordination of the lower to the higher in all things. So the body is to be ruled by the soul, the lower appetites by reason, and reason by God. So too, in society, virtuous subjects should obey wise rulers, those rulers in turn being subject to divine law. In pre-lapsarian society, we would have had harmony in society without coercion or the subjection of one man to another. But sin has disrupted this original condition and unleashed man's desire to exercise dominion over others. Everywhere, the lower is in rebellion against the higher. The freedom that characterized our original condition has gone, to be replaced by coercion and oppression. Perfect justice is practically unrealizable in our workaday world. The city of God, then, is the community of all followers of Christ, and there only is true justice to be found. The earthly city, on the other hand, is guided by self-love. The two cities, different and mutually opposed, owe their existence to the fact that some men live by the standard of the flesh, others by the standard of the Spirit.